Okay. All right, welcome everyone. We're just going to wait a couple minutes to get started, and we are recording this as well. There's interest from people who are not able to make the call, but thank you all for joining. So those who are just signing on, we're just going to start in a couple minutes. So thank you for your patience. All right, we're going to get started in 1 minute. Okay, let's get started. Thanks everybody for joining. I'm Glenn Hurwitz. I'm the CEO and founder of Mighty Earth. We're a global environmental advocacy organization. And I'm very pleased to host my colleagues today to discuss Indonesia's ban on palm oil exports, which has originally was thought that it would just be confined to processed palm oil, but seems by the latest news to be all-encompassing. And this came in response to food price increases, ultimately triggered in part by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and is likely to exacerbate those around the world. And so we want to talk about some of the policy implications, what it means on the ground, and what we're likely to expect going forward. So we brought together an all-star crew to shed some light on that topic, starting with Dr. Chris Malins, founder of Cerulogy and a real authority on land use and bioenergy and many other topics. Tenny, Kristiana, associate researcher at the International Council on Clean Transportation. Annisa, Rahmawati, my colleague, our Indonesia advisor at Mighty Earth, based in Jakarta. And finally, Tim Searchinger, a senior research scholar at Princeton, who's the author of several recent papers about bioenergy and land use and the implications of the war. So without further ado, let me hand it over to Chris to kick it off.
Thanks very much, Glenn. And hi, everybody. I have a couple of slides, hopefully that you can now see, just to give a little bit of introductory context. I'm going to try and speak fairly briefly. So as you are all aware, the Ukraine is normally is a major producer of oil seeds and therefore of vegetable oils, in particular sunflower. And the war in the Ukraine has caused an oilseed supply shock. A normal harvest is not going to be possible. So this has pushed up vegetable oil prices. In response, I believe, to the desire to protect the supply of vegetable oil domestically, Indonesia has announced a ban on palm oil exports, and the war, as well as food prices, has affected fossil fuel and oil prices, of course. So we have a tension. Biofuel mandates use food resources to displace fossil fuels, and for example, in the EU, the biofuel industry has quoting from Euractiv, I think, urged member states not to unilaterally cut biofuel production in response to concerns. So let's look quickly at, beg your pardon, at the price changes that we've seen. As you can see, in the last few months, both vegetable oil prices, there's a palm oil price in blue, and fossil oil prices have leapt up. The impact on palm oil or on vegetable oil has been larger in sort of dollar per ton terms. I think the percentage increase on oil has been a bit higher depending on when you start counting. But this clearly is very disruptive in both markets. And if we look at the quantities involved, I have data that shows that sort of vegetable oil production annually from the Ukraine is something like 7,000 tons. And that's quite comparable to the amount of vegetable oil that the European Union currently consumes for biofuel production. That is virgin oil only, not including used cooking oil. It's also quite comparable to the amount of vegetable oil that Indonesia currently uses for biofuel. But it's much, much less than annual Indonesian palm oil exports. So in terms of scale, a restriction on Indonesian palm oil exports may in fact be more disruptive to the global market than the reductions in production in the Ukraine. And I've just included underneath 2017 numbers as well to remind everyone that in Indonesia in particular, that use of vegetable oils for biofuel has increased a lot in recent years and is intended to continue increasing. So all of this begs the question, could we adjust or could we work with biofuel mandates as part of a response to the current price crisis? Well, as I say, the quantities involved are comparable. So it would certainly be possible in principle to take a lot of pressure out of the market to compensate for that loss of supply by reducing demand, either from the EU biofuel blending mandates or from the Indonesian or similarly with American, other large markets. And there is a history in the EU of relaxing biofuel requirements in response to previous food price crises. This is not unprecedented. The US EPA also has some legal scope to consider the size of mandates in the States. There's no question that an export ban from Indonesia is going to be disruptive. It doesn't mean it's not understandable, but that there's going to be knock-on and negative impacts on other markets. Just a sort of indication of scale, my quick back of the envelope calculation, I estimated that Indonesian palm oil exports to India accounts for the vegetable oil consumption of about 400 million people. So this is significant effects, whichever way you count it. And it's worth mentioning that with food prices by more in dollar terms than oil prices, actually reducing domestic biofuel consumption would probably, assuming that arrangements can be made to replace the diesel fuel, that would be better for Indonesia's balance of trade. There's a lot to be said from the Indonesian point of view for considering a domestic fuel consumption reduction instead of an export reduction. As a final observation before I pass along, it's just worth noting that the whole structure of a biofuel mandate is really intentionally designed to fix consumption. So keep demand fixed in the face of fluctuating food prices. And I think, as has been discussed in previous food price crises, it's worth revisiting that and saying, could the European Union, the United States and other countries and regions think about designing biofuel policies that actually take pressure out of the market instead of maintaining it in these conditions?
Great, thanks so much. And if you have any questions, we'll be able to get to them right after the presentation. Chris, could you stop sharing your screen?
I can, yep, sorry.
Thank you.
There we go.
All right, thanks so much. Now let me pass on to Tenny Kristiana from the International Council on Clean Transportation.
Here when we talk about Indonesia and implication in Southeast Asia, let's start with Indonesia. Yes, the government place this ban to support the cooking oils, but also behind that is actually to support the biofuel production itself by not allocating the CPO allocated for biodiesels to be processed for the cooking oil industries. Because weeks before this ban, there is a talk that even like Aprobi, a chairman, mentioned that the B20 decrease the B30 to B20 or B25 is an option in the tables. But then the government decided to keep the biodiesel mandate at B30s and then take this ban on export itself. And actually with this kind of like crisis, there is things that happen again, because like in 2022, the CPO production in Indonesia is predicted to remain flat. There is a prediction that up less than 4%. And then if this production stay flat by like, let's say 2023, this crisis of this cooking oils could happen again. Why? Because the government has this called a green refinery project, which will produce green fuels there. And currently Pertamina working on the Cilacap phase 1, which will need another 150 kilotons RBDPO. And then the second phase in the next year is going to be like up to 300 kilotons CPO. And then by end 2024, if it's like still on schedule, Pelaju refinery will need around 1 million kiloton. That's like one project in Pertamina. Meanwhile, the government still go with the B40 mandate. They're still ongoing, and right now that, if I'm not mistaken, they're doing the road test. Ministry of Energy mentioned that it will need 3.5 to 4 million kiloliter supply, which it's mean around 3 million tons CPO is needed. Where is this supply will be come from? Decreasing export allocation, as like right now doing the ban, or increasing the production, but we have like bad reader, we don't know what happened with that. So if Indonesia still go with B40s, we need to think again that from where that CPO is gonna like fill the demand. Meanwhile, in Southeast Asia, Malaysia, as we know, production is predicted up like around 5% with the current border opening, with the migrant worker coming, because previously there is a shortage of migrant worker. But then the Malaysia Palm Oil Board mentioned that the productions will be rise just up to 1 million ton, and that's like still not enough. And then remember, weeks ago, like this Malaysia Palm Oil Board mentioned that by end 2022, they will increase the blending from B10, the current blending, to B20. Based on USDA data, in 2021, it shows that Malaysia produced 1 million kiloliter biofuel, biodiesels, which is almost 60% goes for domestic, and let's assume that's like B10, then B20 demand will be higher, the CPO consumption. And meanwhile, these both countries are exporting UCO, as we know, and UCO is being processed as biofuels in another countries, like for example, South Korea, Netherlands, or Singapore itself, like that. I think it's this time for this Southeast Asia or specifically Indonesia and Malaysia, time to diversify their biofuel feedstock from palm to others feedstock, like for example, waste or residue. For Indonesia examples, we did a kind of like research on that, like green diesels or green after under the government program. It could use cooking oil from Indonesia, because in 2021, export from Indonesia is around 250 kilotons, which the total potentials on our calculation is around 700 kilotons. We can use this used cooking oil to produce these green diesels or renewable diesels, as we know. And also the government have another project they call green gasoline, which is come from palm too. That's like another palm demand on that. And we can use the cellulosic ethanol, because our research in Indonesia, for example, palm residue, it could produce 2 million kiloliters, or another agricultural residues up to 5 million kiloliters for Indonesia. So instead of producing green gasoline from palm, they can, support the industries on cellulosic ethanol that using palm residue or another residues. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tenny. Lots of questions come to mind on this, but before we get to those, let's hand it over to our colleague Annisa Rahmawati, who's leading Mighty Earth's efforts in Indonesia. Annisa, curious to hear your thoughts about what's driving these decisions politically and what the implications are likely to be on the ground for people in Indonesia and Southeast Asia.
Yeah, thank you, Glenn. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, and the distinguished speakers and the journalists that are joining this webinar. I just want to add on what the previous speakers have explained before. I think we all admit here that palm oil is a controversial commodity in the global market for decades. Not only about the fluctuative prices and the situation in environment. In one hand, we can expect the abundance of the CPO in the country, while the infrastructures and downstream industry for derivative products and other food products, including biofuel and biodiesel, is yet to be ready to absorb such abundance when the palm oil ban is there by the government. And this is even worse, it can hit the most vulnerable players in the palm oil industry, the smallholders, in which the government shall consider the safeguard and allocate the subsidy properly while blocking of any chance of corruption or leakage at various levels, and do monitoring closely and act on the violations of the corporation. But on the other hand, I think we should understand and assess this issue more carefully. The biggest challenge that we are globally is facing now, and according to the scientists of the world at ICCT, is the climate crisis that threatening the life on Earth, that we might not be able to secure the living degree in our planet or mitigate the impact of the climate change. This due to inaction and greed and selfishness of the corporation and government who has the most power to save the planet more than others. At some point, the palm oil commodity is contributing to the high level of our greenhouse gases emission rising now, and the destructions of our planet, especially due to the tropical deforestation in Indonesia, Africa, and other parts, fires, peatland destruction of indigenous people, of local community land, including the child labor and the human rights violation. We still remember about, for example, the Sime Darby cases for the child labor and the Amnesty report, product and commodity of palm oil coming to US, and it is banned. And at Mighty Earth, in our market campaign, we are calling the industry of cross commodity to ensure its product is deforestation free and conflict free via the implementations of no deforestation, no pit, and no exploitation. And we did regular monitoring and trader trackers on the deforestation linked to the supply chains and report to the grievance mechanism. We do hope that our economy run in a way that is not destroy the forests and social friendly, that's very precious for our life and generation to come. Meanwhile, to support and we need buy-in and support from the government is needed to regulate, review, or even revoke the existing permit that not follow the regulation or the manner that's set by the industry mainstream of the sustainable palm oil. To clean this industry from corruption, this is the government could do. And the government, I think, should improve the good governance related to palm oil management and other natural resources and work on to protect the remaining forests in order and order the company who destroy to restore the forest. This voluntary market commitment actually cannot operate alone. And this required government, strong government in Indonesia to act on law enforcement with a good intention and away from the political and personal interest. And I believe this will put Indonesia as the global sustainable producer of the palm oil in the world and be respected as a country producer and not as a lip service and surface policy that we always, like listen and hearing this again and again. I see this case. The palm oil export ban is a paradox of a country. Even worse, could be a resource curse. And in theory, as the country economy depend mostly on a single export commodity like palm oil and giving too much privilege for the industry with one shock in the market, for example, shortage, crop failure, the war, that will pressurize the supply and demand and disturb it and away from the stable price. And its potential to ruin the country and the global economy risk due to the supply chain that it links and worsen the rampant corruption across levels in Indonesia. The corruption can be done and can be, we experience that cases from getting the permits, the political trade during the election, and then the biodiesel subsidy, including, for example, Wilmar, the biggest traders in the world, that receive around 50% of the total biodiesel subsidy from the palm oil fund since 2015 up to currently. And there is also case of illegal export permit that recently involving, I think about a week ago, involving the trade official and some big players of the palm oil in Indonesia industry, and including Permata Hijau, Musimas, Wilmar Nabati, and its sale to big consumer companies in the world, like Nestle, Unilever, and others. They're buying from Wilmar mostly. And in the other hand, also, I think we are also glad and appreciate to all the stakeholders for the declining deforestation rate from palm oil sector in Indonesia in these 4 years in Indonesia. But I think there is no guarantee it is permanent in the future, given the hindering back law and regulation that announce and implement, for example, the omnibus law that hindering back the environment and social safeguard for the forest protection and other natural resources, the food estate, the biofuel mandate from B30 or up to B40, and from the analysis from the University of Indonesia, saying that for B30, at least Indonesia, from the existing demand side, is actually need for about 40 million hectares of additional land for planting palm oil. So it is huge. And also the operation is also closely connected with the land grabbing of local or indigenous community and also human rights violation, especially in the weak governance regime of the developing country like Indonesia that able to fertilize the corruption and oligarchy to exist, including to maintain its political status quo from local to national with many kinds of way that they are able to get the support for the next election. This is really concerning me.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, so it is for us, in other hand, this is for Indonesia, this is, we should use this palm oil export banning as a turning point to regulate the dirty part of the palm oil industry in the country while stop expanding in the cost of the environment and people. The government should buy in to the industry and DPE market of palm oil. And I think it's a good moment for Indonesia to extend their objective, not only to stabilize the price, but need to see the objective to set the sustainable palm oil market. And the government should be able to develop a safeguard on the most vulnerable actors in this industry. I really concern it. And the government should focus on improving smallholder sectors that have a significant contributions to the palm oil industry, subsidizing the people who need that rather than the rich company, and acts on the stringent regulation for permit review, legal violation, and this is very essential and crucial at the moment. I think that's all I can stop now. And
thank you so much, Annisa. Fascinating. Well, Tim, Annisa mentioned the dramatic decline in deforestation for palm oil by more than 95% for the last 5 years. It's been under 250,000 acres, which is really remarkable. Among other topics I'm sure you'll cover, I'd be interested in your perspective on the threats that this price increase that we're seeing, the export ban, can have both within Indonesia, Southeast Asia, but also globally on deforestation. Thanks so much. Tim, you're on mute right now.
just to kind of just summarize the food crisis situation and the role of biofuels. So right now we have the highest global food prices ever since FAO started putting together its overall food price index in 1990. So vegetable oil is about 2.5 times the price of pre-COVID levels. Grains are about twice the price. What's causing this, of course, is a combination of events. The war in the Ukraine is the most immediate concrete one. Ukraine produces almost 20% of the world's sunflower oil, safflower oil, and cottonseed oil. 13% of the exports. 13% of corn production, 12% of corn exports, 12% of barley exports, 8% of wheat exports. So you've got this shock, obviously, for the war. On top of that, you have fertilizer prices that are now roughly 3 times pre-COVID levels. And that's due both to the overall commodity crisis and the kind of supply chain disruptions coming out of COVID, but then it's also multiplied by the war. Russia and China put export bans on. So we're facing a global food crisis of potentially unprecedented proportions. There's also drought conditions or other disruptions in food supply in the Horn of Africa, West Africa. I think we should all be extremely worried about this massive heat stress going on in India and Pakistan, and could have huge impacts. So the one thing that could actually have a big impact on this would be to cut biofuel mandates. And Chris gave the figure that basically, I think his calculation is 85%. If you cut the EU biodiesel demand by 85%, you could make up for the entire lack of loss of Ukrainian vegetable oil production. We calculated that a 50% cut in grain ethanol in both the EU and the US could replace all of Ukraine's grain exports. And so this is really the only thing that could have an immediate impact of that magnitude. It's also important to do this for more than 1 year. In the food crisis that we had in 2008 and 2011, a big part of it was the expectation of continuing biofuel production increases. So one thing that triggers food prices is when people who hold stocks of grain or vegetable oil are unwilling to sell it because they expect future prices to be higher. So you need a kind of not just an immediate reduction, but an expected reduction for next year that then relieves the pressure on stocks. The good news is that stocks are higher than they were in 2008 and 2011. So this suggests that we could actually have a big impact if we lowered the biofuel production. Now, the longer term issues are that biofuels are obviously increasing, and we are having record global expansion of cropland based on new studies that we have of the size of roughly 3 times the size of the Netherlands every year. And we are having very high rates of deforestation. The good news is that it has been decreased in Indonesia. Palm oil is going into other already deforested land, but there's a rebound effect to some extent where there's increased deforestation from expansion of other types of food production. But the bottom line is that we are facing on a global basis, and including from palm oil in Africa and Latin America, a massive expansion of agricultural land. It's now at a rate that's equal to twice, if we continue this the next 30 years, just cropland, not even counting pasture, would be twice the size of India. And that's without kind of additional large increases in bioenergy. So the last thing I'll mention is it's obviously, but one of the things that's happened is that the US and European biofuel requirements are now being imitated in the rest of the world. Indonesia, of course, most prominent example, but Thailand is another example of that. So we're getting large-scale pressure on biofuels. And we just put out a report at Princeton that the EU's climate strategy for 2050 basically relies on taking 20% of the EU's cropland and turning it into energy crops. And it doesn't matter if it's a food crop or an energy crop, it's the land. And that report also goes into the fact that the EU is actually a large importer of, in effect, land. It imports food on a net basis that leads to large-scale use of land, basically about a quarter for every 4 hectares of land in the EU and cropland. It basically uses on a net basis 1 hectare outside of the EU. And so in effect, its plan is simply to offshore its food requirements. So this, you're seeing both the short-term and the long-term effect of biofuels. You tend to get large-scale expansion of agricultural land in these periods of high prices. That's when you'll get a shake. So we should expect an increase in deforestation. But I think really what we're looking at potentially is an unprecedented food crisis. And the only way to deal with that in any meaningful way in the next year is going to be to reduce biofuel. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you so much, Tim. Now I'd like to open it up for questions to any of our panelists. You could say your name, your outlet, and ask and to whom you're addressing the question. That would be really helpful. Megan.
Hi, hello. I'm sorry, I missed the start of the presentation, so apologies if you already addressed this question, but if we reduce the biofuel mandates in order to help keep food prices down, what are we going to replace that fuel with? I'm just wondering if, you know, there's a holistic view taken here, because surely that's then going to have to be replaced by fossil fuels. I'm not sure what the broader picture is here. What do you use instead that isn't going to basically undermine a green transition?
Well, this is Tim Searchinger. I mean, yes, you use fossil fuels, but of course, this is a longer discussion, but the biofuels are a major driver of expanding agricultural land, and the greenhouse gas emissions from that expansion are, you can show, in general, greatly exceed over 30 years any savings from fossil fuels. So it's not green, even putting aside food crisis problems, it's driving global deforestation, other land use change. And so it's not a green transition. Now, it is true that obviously there's also an energy crisis and problems. And of course, the West, where food prices are sometimes less politically sensitive even than oil prices, because the worst effects of high food prices are on the poor around the rest of the world. Yeah, it would have some effect on that supply, but it's a heck of a lot easier globally to replace fuel than it is to replace food. And so in the US, all biofuels are about 5% of transport, the total transport sector. So if you cut, you'd have to get a couple more percent replaced from oil somewhere, or do something else in the energy sector. In the EU, it's maybe like 5% also of total transport. It's about 7% of road transport. So yeah, if you cut that, you'd have to kind of do some replacements too. But as I said, it's a lot easier to pump more oil or to deal with things there than to magically replace massive quantities of food. So that's really the trade-off.
Chris, any anything to add there on the price dynamics between food and fuel?
Not much. I think Tim said that well. Maybe the final observation would be that the sort of the scale of the oil market, of course, is very large. The scale of the edible oil market is also pretty big, but it is smaller. So for the same amount of material, you're probably more disruptive in the vegetable oil market than as Tim said, than trying to replace that in the energy market would be. So it's not an easy solution, but as Tim said, it's very questionable whether this use of vegetable oils for fuel is really delivering much climate benefit anyway. So there's worse things that one can do in terms of undermining the energy transition than to take the foot off the gas on a on a temporary basis or even more permanent basis on some of the biofuel mandates.
Yeah, just on that figure. So we did a calculation that the greenhouse gas emissions from converting land, sufficient amount of land to produce a sufficient amount of biodiesel to replace 1 ton of carbon emissions from fossil fuels releases 3 tons of carbon. So on average, to produce vegetable oil in the world, really almost any vegetable oil in the world, you're going to release 3 times as much carbon to do that as over a 30-year period. Well, you'll do that all up front, but the point is then that will be exceeding even the fossil fuel savings over 30 years.
Thanks. Sarah.
Thanks. This is Sarah Schoenhart from E&E News. I'm struck by that figure, Tim, and I'm curious if you have any insights on what might be then driving these policies from the US and EU. I mean, the US talks about biofuels as being a cleaner alternative to our fossil fuels. So that's, I guess, my first question. The second question I have is what you think and this is to the panel broadly, the implications of Indonesia's palm oil ban might be. There have been so many calls for countries not to put up protective barriers and bans at this time. And so I'm curious how people might respond to Indonesia's decision to ban exports.
Yeah. So on the first question, obviously it's a broader question, but the bottom line is that, I've written oodles and oodles and oodles of stuff of this over the years, is that the assumption that, or estimate or claim that biofuels reduces greenhouse gas emissions is premised on the idea that essentially land is free, has no opportunity cost from a carbon standpoint. So in very quick summary, the calculations ignore the carbon emitted from burning biofuels. Now, when you burn biofuels, you're going to emit at least as much, and typically at least 50% more carbon per mile that you drive. But people are just from the combustion of the biofuel. So, well, then for fossil fuels. So why do people ignore it? Well, it's based on the idea that when you grow plants, you absorb carbon, and that offsets the carbon emitted from burning it. But the problem is it takes land to grow plants. So if you're using land for biofuels, you're not using it to store carbon, or you're not using it to produce food so that other land can store carbon. And the basic analysis has ignored that completely. So basically land is free. And so that assumption led to all of these claims of biofuel benefits. And then of course the politics came in to, what a wonderful thing. Wouldn't it be great if you could solve climate change by simultaneously subsidizing your agricultural sectors? So that's kind of the, the 2-second or the 30-second history of that. And on the export bans, we saw this before. I mean, we can call for all of this to stop this, but governments are incredibly sensitive to food price increases. And so they're going to put on export bans. And of course, when one does it, it unfortunately typically leads to others. And so that's just frankly to be expected. And so obviously we need to fight against it, but it's also to be expected. I mean, the shocking thing in Indonesia is that they're putting on an export ban instead of decreasing their biodiesel production, which is, incredible, actually. So that's basically the story. That's what happens. And what people forget is that the world changes in periods of crisis. Policies are made, people build new roads, which leads to more deforestation down the line. People clear land to take advantage of extremely high prices. So one reason, of course, Indonesia is in a position to not convert as much land for palm oil recently is that it converted so much land. And it already cut down a huge number of trees. So it has a kind of a surplus of, in a way, of land that you can use. But over time, you use up that surplus. And if you continue to grow your biodiesel, you're going to start clearing land again for palm oil, even in Indonesia, let alone in the rest of the world. So that's the thing. Crises are when bad things really happen. And we know that when you have food crises, that is what occupies governments. That becomes the dominant issue, particularly outside of the West, where for the most part, we don't see the food prices as much because our food prices are actually at the grocery store more influenced by things that affect the retail sector than the wholesale sector. But that's not true in the rest of the world.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? Further comments from the panelists? Well, if not, Megan, are you raising your hand again?
Yes,
Okay.
sorry, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question for Annisa. So I'm just wondering, I mean, it was a bit confusing what was going on with the palm oil exports in Indonesia because they said they were going to do it, and then I think they changed their mind, and they said they were going to do it again, stop the exports. I mean, how long do you think this is this just a knee-jerk reaction policy? And, is it actually going to make any difference to ordinary people? I mean, how long do you think it's going to last for, and how long, and what do you think the impact will be, sort of both inside Indonesia and then on cooking oil prices and other kind of prices where there's a large element of palm oil involved outside of Indonesia and some other sort of developing countries? Is this going to be a policy that is just going to have the opposite impact to what they were hoping for?
Yeah, very interesting question. I guess the way that we see it, like the natures, how the current regime is responding to the situation. For example, the extinction, like the scarcity of the cooking oil, and they are already trying some attempts to stabilize the price. So the objective is to stabilize the price. And from my understanding, given the infrastructures of biofuel and also the readiness and the dependency from the company that supply and export the CPO to the outside world, I think this is something that not gonna be long. And if it is long, we have to see the system that has to be created for the most vulnerable actors, which is the people, which is the smallholders. And at this point, that Indonesian palm oil governance is so messy with all the lip service and sort of unclear direction, and also the political interest. Everything now in Indonesia is now playing around going for the general election in 2024, which is very concerning. Everything can be sort of a source, how to mobilize people in order to get the new leaders, which is maybe not new leaders, but then the status quo is trying to, stay on the powers. And according to the prediction and maybe the request from the Palm Oil Smallholder Association, like SPKS, is actually the request, I think officially, that it's not should be like more than 7 days, which is, for me, whether that kind of things is, it's just only a surface policy. It's just only to show how your leadership is actually on the side of the poor people, on the side of the people who need, a decent price for cooking oil. Because actually, go for the biofuel, I don't think that we are already ready for that. And when the government cannot or failure also doing this, creating the safeguard from the smallholders, that there will be a chaos. So I hope that it will be kind of a not permanent, but Indonesia has to set their own goal and objective to create a new palm oil market which is sustainable by the NDPE, and also to regulate, to review the good governance for the forest protections, as well as the industry in operation. Because now, at the moment, even though that the tendency of the declining deforestation rate is not a guarantee. If the political power inside is claiming that we have to, for example, develop infrastructures, giving the food estate whatever basis, there was an attempt as well for the economic recovery after the pandemic to open some pristine forests or some forest area in Indonesia. So we see that the power is able to set or to change the situation on the ground, and this has to be prevented in a way that we are monitoring from the national stakeholders as well as the international, because Indonesia also have a contribution in deforestation, but also an opportunity to save or to increase the conservation to tackle the climate change that we are facing now. So I think it will not gonna be permanent in the long term. Otherwise, we don't see anything that's set in the regulation or even decision. So what will be the criteria, term of conditions of how this palm oil export ban will be implemented? So I don't see this will be kind of permanent unless there has a safeguard for the most vulnerable stakeholders in this industry. Thank you, Megan.
Can I just ask, how much, what percentage of production does Indonesia consume domestically? Because they're the largest palm oil exporter in the world. I imagine that there will be major pushback from producers and others who want to continue production without having to deal with storage constraints and other things by stopping exports. I'm just curious, it doesn't seem like it will be able to last long just logistically.
Yeah, I think about 10 to 20% for the cooking oil, and other will go for export, and also the mandatory of the biodiesel that now developed by the government.
Any comment on that, Tenny? Or
yeah, probably I can add to that. It's like most likely on the data on 2020 is around almost like 69% to go for export, and then 31% for domestic, which is combined this cooking oil and biofuels. But looks like last year 2021 is like slightly changed to 65% to export, and then 35% for domestic. It's around 30%. let's say.
It's not that 50-50, right? So it's like
Yeah, it's not.
more to the for the export, I believe.
And that's like for the 30% for domestic is actually for biodiesels. I mean, like for biofuel is increasing, while for food is decreasing the share. Previously, food is like the higher, and then the biodiesel mandate is continue increase, right? For example, this year is like 10.2 or 5 million kiloliters compared to like previously only like 9 million.
Wow. So that's the majority now of palm oil consumption in Indonesia would be biodiesel now. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. That
Thirds?
would be.
It's about
The phrase.
2/3.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Wow.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions? Great. Well, thank you so much. And if you have any follow-ups, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us at press@mightyearth.org, or you can contact me directly, Glenn, Glenn, @mightyearth.org. There's one question here, it seems like from Mauro, but I think he has jumped off the call, so we'll follow up with him.
Oh, and I got a request from Megan to send us this study I mentioned. Okay, I'll do that.
Great. Yeah, we can certainly circulate those. Well, thank you, everybody. And feel free, of course, to follow up with the panelists. We're happy to facilitate that as well. All right. Take care. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care. Have a nice day.
Bye.